Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. And in this one, we're going to be covering the best specializations that can get you some serious rating gains in Battleground Blitz for 11.0.7. We're going to be looking at the data, throwing in a little bit of opinion as well. This bracket is a great bracket to kind of break some personal records, as you are able to get exceedingly higher in terms of overall rating than any other bracket. Although that rating comes slowly, it's a lot more certain than the arena bracket. So if you want to start pushing up towards like 3,000 rating or something like that, this is the bracket to do it. The data was honestly surprising to me when it first came in, because I had some assumptions for the bracket as to what specializations would likely be looking strong, but some definitely caught me off guard. The first one being Ret Paladin. We can see that pink line right at the top. It is skyrocketing over every single other melee DPS. By far the best melee DPS for the bracket, and this is likely because it has incredibly strong 1v1. It's pretty much killing it in any matchup. I recently participated in a dueling tournament, and there was a Ret Paladin Death Knight team that signed up, and they were almost taking out Calvish and Nick, which were looking like the winners to be, playing Rogue and Mage. So the potential for Ret Paladin is quite limitless. It holds a lot of escape mechanisms to be able to defend bases, so I think it makes a lot of sense, both in terms of strategy, utility, as well as overall throughput. Ret Paladin is actually the go-to melee DPS, which I think a lot of people initially would be like, hey, Ret Paladin moves kind of slow. I would have thought mobility is important here, but I think its damage output, its 1v1 potential, and its utility in order to hold bases and to steal bases away from enemies is just extraordinarily good, and we see that represented in the chart. The next ones, which I found to be surprising to be so high, which are warriors. I was really expecting rogues to be towards the top here, but arms warriors holding solid at like a 15% popularity rate here for the bracket. So this is also a really impressive showing. Again, Arms Warrior I think participates really well in team fight, bringing Sharpened Blade for healing reduction. You can really just train down casters and put a lot of pressure on them to limit their damage output. So in terms of team fight, I think that makes sense for Arms Warrior. Its 1v1 is not completely terrible. Having played it myself a bit now, it's got at least a little bit of a decent 1v1, but I think its main strength is team fight, and because of its mortal strike effect, it can actually have an impact in those team fight scenarios, so you're going to feel like you have more control in the outcome of those, as opposed to a lot of other classes kind of like coin flippy, or team fights feel endless. So I think it does actually make sense to me. It's also just really fun to just spam Rens onto everything with Thunderclap. Fury Warrior is also surprisingly very high as well here at, a 12% to almost a 15% for some weeks, as the third highest represented melee. So I was really expecting rogues and feral druids, honestly, and maybe even survival hunters to be higher than this, given my personal experience. But this is the overall ladder, so maybe this is like towards the bottom end. Warriors are just more popular. Could also be part of the assessment, because we can't really break it down as far as rating is concerned, so take that into account when we're analyzing this. But as you get higher, I would imagine this graph does change a bit. For Rogues, Assassination, definitely a lot popular here, but it's kind of fell off in this most recent week, with Subtlety Rogue upticking, in tandem with it going down, which is a little surprising. I think Assassination is just the most well-rounded rogue spec for Battleground Blitz, because it can participate significantly in team fights while still having solid 1v1 and base defending and base ninjaing capabilities. But I think Subtlety Rogue does kind of take the cake when it comes to 1v1s and what it can do in that regard. So you're probably going to feel more flashy on the Subtlety Rogue, but if you're not really the playmaker type, then Assassination is probably going to be the better pick in that sense. But it's performing really well. Havoc Demon Hunter's been just riding in the middle, and I think it makes sense for it. It's got just really good throughput overall, really good team utility, really good mobility to escape around the map, really good team fight engagement. It can shut down healers very easily. I think it makes sense that it's riding kind of like through the middle of the pack, even despite kind of being, I would say less popular than it's probably ever been. It's still holding strong in the Battleground Blitz bracket. For Feral Druids, it's also holding strong in the middle, which I think makes sense. Really good 1v1 potential. Definitely has decent team fight as well, with the AoE rip builds that you can run, and bringing mortal wounds is also super important. So, and the ability to cyclone and knock enemies out of certain base maps, so you can take control of them as the card is moving on the payload. I think with its kit, it's definitely understandable that it's going to be riding throughout the kind of the mid range of the bracket. We got Unholy DK that's been kind of on a roller coaster of kind of like up and down and up and down and up and down, probably based on the buffs, and nerfs that it received for a while, but it's still riding in the middle. And I think think Death Knight, no matter what, even regardless of tuning, is going to be viable with Chains of Ice and Death Grip. It's just so vital as far as preventing flag carriers, preventing just enemies from moving around the map. You can completely just, take control of the game with Chains of Ice and Death Grip, irregardless of even if you attack. But if it obviously has good damage on top of that, then you're going to be extremely viable in that sense. Windwalker seems to be on a downward trend, although it's been kind of like a roller coaster throughout the season. It seems to be on an overall down point here, even despite getting a lot of buffs. It's got decent 1v1. I think mobility is probably where it kind of gets hit a little bit. It can have a hard time keeping up with some classes, ironically, even though you expect Windwalker to be the super fast spec. But I think it can have a harder time than like a Feral Druid or a Rogue getting on certain classes. And its team fight is probably less impactful than that of a Warrior. You probably get controlled a lot easier. You don't have like the Bladestorm immunity burst windows, so it's easier to CC you during those times. And Windwalker has generally, I would say, been less popular in Battlegrounds historically through multiple expansions. So it is one that you're going into that one as the underdog for sure. Frost DK kind of having a little bit of a resurgence, but Unholy seemingly still a little bit more popular than it. That's likely just because it does better sustain overall damage. But I think Frost Death Knight's ability to kind of get execute power and burst damage should not be totally thrown away if you want to be a Frost DK. And again, Chains of Ice Grip, it's the same on all Death Knight specs, so it doesn't really matter. But I don't think this should be cast away, even though you're seeing a trend towards the bottom here at the moment. I definitely think it's still a strong contender. Enhancement Shaman is coming in at third to the bottom at 3.69%. I think enhancement can sometimes be kind of sleeper too, although I do think you need to be playing at the highest level of it. But I have seen a few enhancement shamans that can definitely pump numbers on the specialization. Decent 1v1. I'd say its main issues come with like crowd control avoidance. It's not gonna be like the best base defender. In team fight, it can be hard to really feel like you have impact. Might depend on the healer breakdown. If you got a lot of Mistweaver monks where you can hex one and there's no decurse, you might feel like you have a little bit more impact. Static field totem and knockbacks are still really potent, really effective. You can be clutch with that, and its damage profile isn't terrible. So even despite it, kind of being third from the bottom, I think that it can still have a decent run. And the biggest surprise to me on this analysis is Survival Hunter being towards the bottom. Now, I think this is likely more of just a popularity thing because from my experience earlier on in the season of Battleground Blitz and seeing Paradise 1 on Survival Hunter is that it had like really good, base ninjaing capabilities. Maybe its team fight's a little bit lackluster, but even that, I don't know. When you open up burst with your burst damage, you have a lot of AoE. You can do like, even in arena, I can peak like 1.72 million DPS. I can only imagine with so many targets. I'm gonna have to give a BGB a go here on Survival Hunter just to see that, because I would have expected Survival to be a bit higher than this. I think it's just likely that Survival Hunter is just not as popular as a lot of the other melee DPS, unless it's like exceedingly more powerful than other specs, because I would have thought that its performance would be a lot better. Overall, the performance, I think, of the specs is pretty healthy. Ret Paladin obviously is a big outlier here, but it seems like you can make pretty much every melee DPS work in the bracket if you want to, but some of them towards the bottom end a little bit more underdog. Outlaw Rogue is another one, actually, since I forgot to mention here. It's a little bit sleeper because I think it can be a really good flag carrier with the grappling hook builds, but I think it's just its burst damage and its impactful team fight damage. Like, it does tickle AoE damage. I think that's where it probably falls off. You can be really clutch with it on some maps, like flag carrying maps, but I think that it'll struggle with the execute power of assassination and the burst potential subtlety, which is probably why it's riding a little bit lower. It's also harder to play, so it's likely going to be less popular overall. Now, when we look at range DPS, you can see this is a little bit more balanced, at least towards the top end, with Beast Mastery Hunter riding in the last week at the top for the ranged, as you would expect, given how popular and strong it is in Arena. It's the same thing in BGB, so BM Hunter seems to just be really well-rounded no matter what bracket you want to go into. Affliction Warlock is still riding out towards the top as well, so if you're somebody who wants to do BGB and Arena, like, these are going to be really good picks for both of those. Boomkin comes into its forte with Battleground Blitz relative to Arena. I think the type of control it has, the range damage it has, the AoE builds that you can play with it definitely enable it to be a monster. And you have tools that can deal with like monk portals with flags. You can wild charge up to them, typhoon them down, and you have tools to play around that type of defensive kit, which is really nice. It's just got really good team fight basically, and you have enough healers to keep you alive despite your fragility. So I think this is definitely the bracket if you're a Boomkin player. And Frost Mage, I think riding up here is not not unexpected. The Ice Wall and Ring of Frost AoE CCs line of sight tools are really strong, and the snares are really good for just displacing enemies no matter where they're moving on the fight. So I'm not really surprised to see Frost Mage up here towards the top. I don't know what's going on with Marksmanship Hunter. The data looks like it's inconsistent, not going all the way through, but it is definitely riding through the middle of the pack. Definitely still a viable option. Still has really solid burst and solid range damage. Say that you can sneak up on flag carriers with camouflage, the instant CC with Diamond Ice Trap to be able to execute power on flag carriers with CC on the healer, I think is likely why this rides through the middle, and it's just always historically been a really good battleground spec. Shadow Priest riding through the middle as well. I think this makes a lot of sense. Just really good overall damage, really good team utility, really good sustain healing for the team. Downside is mobility, which again, these specs definitely carry a little bit more mobility, which might be where this is edging a little bit ahead for them. Destruction Warlock riding through the middle. It's really benefiting from the buffs that I got in Battleground Blitz. You can see it riding through the center for a while and still just holding a strong position there. Range DPS balance seems to be reasonably well here for Battleground Blitz. Elemental Shaman as well, just really good sustain damage, really tanky, a really nice disruption with Grounding Totem. I think it's super overpowered in Battlegrounds, especially when you can hide it somewhere. And Static Field Totem for knocking enemies around is similar to Death Grip, as well as Thunderstorm. So it's not surprising to see Elemental Shaman here. I think it's a really solid pick. Devastation, though, seems to be falling off, bro. It fell off really hard. Devastation is just completely disappearing. And I think that's because Devastation is kind of like, it's a hit or miss spec. You either 100-0 somebody really quickly and then you get the kill and you move on, or you don't and then you feel like you're doing nothing. And Battleground Blitz, it's really hard to cheese those types of kills. So your overall sustain maybe feels less impactful. Also, there's a lot of rogues that are really popular. So getting trained by a rogue as Devastation is going to be really hard. You don't really have a lot of stealth. You don't have any stealth in order to kind of like sneak up on certain locations. You're just purely a burst spec in team fight is the way that I see this, and you're probably a terrible base defender or a base ninja, or you just don't have any real tools in that regard. So seeing its popularity fall off here, I think that's likely the case. And Demonology, which I was expecting to be the worst, it's hanging out to the bottom, but it's actually it's above Devastation. I think the main problem with Demonology is your pets just get kited, snared, rooted. It's hard to make them move around, get to certain locations. When all of your damage is coming from pets, you need to plant for a while. So like maybe you're decent in team fight situations, can be maybe a base defender with all the pets that you have in order to peel for the node, but it's probably hit or miss because you get flag carry map and then you're probably going to feel like you can't get around the map, and it's going to be a lot harder for you. Arcane Mage, I think Arcane Mage is like Outlaw Rogue, where it's like its popularity is determined just because it's so much more complex, and you're easier to shut down, I think is the main reason that we see Arcane kind of towards the bottom here. I think it's just frost damage is all instant. You can't really get around it. So as Arcane, you need to cast and you can get disrupted. But I see a lot of Arcane Mages have strong like assassination power with this specialization. So I think it's mostly its popularity and its difficulty to play in relation to that's leading it to be so low. And then Fire Mage is obviously a tuning thing. Fire Mage down here is 100% a tuning thing. Its damage output is just not comparable to the other casters, so it's kind of an avoid spec, it seems like, for Arena and Battleground Blitz. So unfortunate for the Fire Mages. When we look at the healer breakdown, we can see Mistweavers and Priests, they're having a little romantic get-together dance, intermingling with each other at the top here. And for a while, Disc Priest was kind of like falling off a bit, but it's definitely made a resurgence here, and it's looking competitive with Mistweaver, considering that they are constantly trading places back and forth. I think the damage contribution of Disc is likely a huge contributing factor to why it's so high. And also, it's just a really fun healer to play at the moment. And when it's fun and it's strong, it's going to be really popular. So I think that's likely a big case. I would imagine as you get towards more higher ratings, that Mistweaver probably takes over a bit more. I think the mobility on it is just still absolutely crazy. It provides really good utility to the team just through mobility alone, but those are obviously both really good picks at the moment. For the rest of the healers that are all kind of competing with each other here towards the middle of the pack, looking pretty decently competitive with each other at least. Restless Shaman saw a huge resurgence when it got buffs and then immediately went back down into kind of the middle of the pack. And again, it's mostly because if you're playing Totemic, your healing is limited to certain areas, which can be great when your allies are stacking up, like Gilneas or something like that. You might feel like you have really good throughput in those scenarios, but you're going to have to really be a master, I think, of the specialization if you want to try and come close to competing with even kind of just above average or average level Disc Priests or Mistweaver monks. Holy Paladin still holds at a solid margin. But you can see it falls off quite heavily relative to Arena. Although I want to say this is a significant improvement to the initial experience for Holy Paladin. It felt like it was really weak. You know, the inability to use a lot of its cooldowns on flag carriers. You can't use Blessing Protection on flag carriers. I really thought was going to inhibit it. But the buffs obviously made it a lot more competitive throughout the earlier parts of the season, that it's still holding strong in the middle of the pack for the healers. For Resto Druid, it's kind of just up and down. It's kind of more towards the low end. I think it's, again, more of just an overall throughput thing. Its mobility isn't as competitive, I want to say, as Mistweaver Monk as far as being a flag carrier. I think the portal really adds an extra edge, being able to go through Z-axes and multiple walls that Druid just can't really keep up with. And you can kind of get trained down. It's really, Resto Druid excels when you have less targets to heal, which is weird because it used to be the main AoE healer, but now it's, if you have life bloom on, you can only have life bloom on 2 targets. So if people are hitting targets that don't have life bloom, your healing starts to become a bit of a struggle. I think that's likely where it's starting to fall behind in Battleground Blitz. Prez holding out, second to the bottom here. Still at a decent margin of representation at 6% though. Again, it's limited range, I think, is the main thing holding it back. You can get easily crowd controlled. You got to get really close. You can add burst damage, but again, burst damage, I don't know how valuable it is because it's very easy to recover through with a cooldown. And then you kind of run out of ammo, where something like a Disc Priest is just constantly pumping those numbers, constantly whittling away at the mana, whittling away at the defense. And I think sustain tends to be a little bit more valuable, at least right now at Battleground Blitz. And then Holy Priest at the bottom, but not terribly at the bottom. 4.62%. Again, this is the same deal. Holy against Disc Priest, they're the same class, different specs, but Holy's damage is burst based and not sustain based, and we can see the value that brings. And also, its healing is burst based rather than more so sustain based, like Discipline Priest. So it starts to struggle there as well. You top a target off, and then you start falling behind to the overall sustain damage that's coming through. So I think that makes sense. For tanks, I don't know if we are able to even look at tanks. I'm surprised that we can't. There's no filter for it. It is not possible to look at this, I don't think. Okay, I don't think we're tracking tanks, which is weird for Battleground Blitz because this is actually the bracket where maybe you would actually care about it, but the data, we're not able to look at it. So unfortunate for that, but you can see Battleground Blitz is a lot more balanced. There's a couple of specs, some outliers from ranged melee that you probably want to avoid, but for the most part, you can get through on most of these specializations and have a decent time, I would say, as I've outlined the strengths and the weaknesses, the pros and the cons of them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this analysis of the 11.0.7 Battleground Blitz meta, and thank you guys very much for watching. Your support is greatly appreciated.